Hello friends, welcome to Winter at St. Andrew. It is my privilege to welcome you here today from the beautiful St. Andrew Sanctuary. I am grateful as always to share this sacred online space with you, where we are all invited, included, and valued as vital and beloved members of our broader worshiping community. With its long nights and quiet days, winter invites us into new rhythms and routines that make possible the rest, renewal, and rootedness our bodies and souls long for. What appears to be a season of dormancy is a time of stillness and hidden growth essential to all of life. At St. Andrew, we offer an abundance of opportunities throughout this season for self-care, spiritual growth, finding community, and serving others. You can visit gostandrew.com/winter for more information. We are proud to be an open, affirming, inclusive congregation that welcomes all people into the full life and communion of our church. This includes saints and sinners, believers and skeptics, the lost and the found, the wanderers and the wanderers, families of all shapes and sizes, and people from every point along life's journey. No matter who you are or where you've been, no matter what you believe or even if you believe anything at all, you are welcome at St. Andrew and you belong here. If you have any questions about our church, prayer requests for our care team, or if you would like to get in touch with a member of our pastoral team or staff, please email info@gostandrew.com. If you would like to explore deeper engagement with the St. Andrew community through our many classes, group life gatherings, and service opportunities, you can email us directly at connect@gostandrew.com. We'd love to hear from you. Just as a reminder, our full Sunday morning worship services, complete with music, prayer, announcements, liturgy, ministry spotlights, and the sermon, are live streamed on our YouTube page each week and permanently archived for viewing anytime. Lastly, to contribute a financial gift to the work and ministry of St. Andrew, you can always visit gostandrew.com/give or text St. Andrew to 28950. And now let's listen together to this week's scripture and sermon.
A reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 12, verses 24 through 33. Very truly, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Those who love their life lose it, and those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, there will my servant be also. Whoever serves me, the Father will honor. Now my soul is troubled, and what should I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it is for this reason that I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came from heaven. I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. The crowd standing there heard it and said that it was thunder. Others said, an angel has spoken to him. Jesus answered, this voice has come for your sake, not for mine. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. He said this to indicate the kind of death he was to die.
Over the years, I have lost count of the number of people I've known who have found comfort in the popular adage that says, God never gives us more than we can bear. In the face of hardship, loss, illness, or even death, it's not uncommon for people to look for strength and consolation in familiar aphorisms like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, or God helps those who help themselves, or God never gives us more than we can bear. And for as much as these proverbs can be encouraging in hard times, it's easy to forget that none of them are actually found anywhere in the Bible. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger came from the 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who was actually a proud atheist. And it was later popularized in a song by pop star Kelly Clarkson. God helps those who help themselves, not in the Bible either. It came from Sophocles and later became a favorite proverb of Ben Franklin. But God never gives us more than we can bear. That sounds kind of Bible-y, doesn't it? But it's actually a seriously botched translation of the Apostle Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians, which says, God will not let you be tested or tempted beyond your strength. I've sat with so many people over the years who have borne more pain or suffering than any of us could imagine bearing on our own. And I've known too many others who've been overwhelmed, even crushed by the burdens of life, that I cannot affirm that cliche that God never gives us more than we can bear. While it's intended to embolden a person to not give up, to stay in the fight, it implies that God is the source, the giver of every tragedy, every hardship we endure, dishing out a measure of suffering in proportion to our personal capacity to handle it. A lot of people find that kind of God hard to love or trust or even believe in. If God is responsible for all the awful, inexplicable things that happen to us, how is it possible to call God good and loving? There's a better, more biblical way to understand how God works in our hardships and suffering. It holds that the struggles we experience in life very often create the conditions by which new life is made possible. That out of our worst experiences, even when all seems lost and we are at the end of our rope, God's work is always to call us, to sift through the rubble and the ruins, and to begin creating something new by rebuilding our lives with whatever parts may be salvageable and whatever new possibilities God may be offering to us in the moment. Someone once said to me, when I lost my job, I thought it was the end of the world for me. And at first I was hopeless, but slowly, he said, I made some changes. I redirected my interests and priorities, and I came to see now that something good came out of it all. Something far better, in fact, than what I had lost. Someone recently said to me, when my marriage ended, it was the worst thing that had ever happened to me. I was crushed, betrayed, I grieved. But eventually, she said, I met someone and discovered a depth of love that I never knew before. There's a story about a man named Joseph in the book of Genesis who was sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, left for dead, endured years of suffering and imprisonment and abuse, and yet somehow eventually rose up to become the second most powerful man in Egypt. And years later, that man Joseph reunited with those rotten brothers who were responsible for so much of his suffering. And Joseph said, what I went through was the worst thing imaginable, and you, brothers, meant it for evil. But he said, I see now that God found a way to use it for good. Don't get me wrong, this is not about looking for the silver lining or making lemonade out of lemons. Throughout the Bible, the hardest struggles often create the conditions by which new life is possible. This is the one thread that runs through the entire Bible. In fact, the Bible suggests it's how the universe and everything in it came to be in the first place. Before there was anything like a sky, oceans, trees, or brook trout, or blue-tailed skinks, or beautiful people like you, there was only this dark, soupy mess of mass chaos swirling around in space, what the ancient Hebrews called tohu vavohu, which means something like the wild and the waste, the empty and the void between being and not being. Tohu vavohu. Maybe that phrase describes a little bit about what we all feel whenever our lives are unraveling or when we are overwhelmed. Tohu vavohu. In Genesis, God calls out to that tohu vavohu and says, let there be light, let there be life, let there be ... It's this divine call. spoken into the empty and the void between being and non-being at the very first moment of creation. And that voice has been calling out to all the tohu vavohu of our lives and our world ever since. God's work is to call to life what once seemed to have no possibility for life at all. In the rubble, the ruins, the waste, and the wild, God sees the very conditions, the material, for something more beautiful and fruitful and more enduring than what once was. Jesus said it this way. He said, unless a grain of wheat dies and is buried, it remains just a single seed. But if that seed is buried, he says, it will eventually sprout and produce something beautiful and fruitful. In the 12th chapter of John's Gospel, things take this dramatic turn in Jesus' life. He's on his way to Jerusalem. When he arrives in Jerusalem, he will be arrested, tried, and crucified. He knows this, and yet he goes to Jerusalem willingly. He says the hour has arrived. It's time, he tells his disciples. Jesus knows how devastating it will be for his disciples to witness what he's about to endure. Public crucifixion on a cross was the worst thing that could ever happen to a human being. It was meant to be bloody and brutal and excruciating and humiliating, and meant to be a clear warning to everyone that this is what happens when you cross wires with the Roman Empire. When Jesus enters Jerusalem, he's already a wanted man. His entrance into the city is akin to surrender. But still, he doesn't have to do it. Instead, he could choose to go underground to evade those that were plotting to kill him. He could choose to stop preaching altogether and just disappear completely from the public eye. And either of those options might have prolonged or even saved his life, but then again, why would Jesus ever think of running from the truth that he's been preaching for 3 whole years? This truth that he believes with every fiber of his being, that the kingdom of God is here now, and that the powers of love and forgiveness and mercy will prevail against the powers of hate, war, and retribution. That God will give us new hearts and new minds if only we change our ways and become a part of what God was doing in the world, which was, in fact, what God has been doing ever since the very beginning of time, calling all that chaos, all that tohu vavohu, all that wild and waste of the world, calling it to come to light and life and order and peace and shalom. Jesus will not run or hide to save his life, because his mission is not to save his life at all. It's to save us from destroying ourselves. And so Jesus chooses not to run from this hour, but to face it. He knows what it will mean for him. It will cost him his life. But in facing this moment of truth, Jesus teaches all of us how to face whatever it is we know we cannot run from either. Those hard decisions we must make, the moments that demand of us moral courage, the call to step out, to speak up, to act, even when we know it will cost us something. Unless a grain of wheat is buried in the ground, he says, it's never more than just a grain of wheat. But if it is buried, it eventually sprouts and produces something beautiful. The seed that Jesus is speaking about is his life. It will soon be buried in the earth, but it will eventually bear much fruit. And look, here we are today, followers of his way, doing our best to carry out the mission he gave his life for. You and me, all of us, are the living fruit of that buried seed that is his life. Jesus' lesson is clear, and I think it's one we know intuitively, but it's still paradoxical, counterintuitive. That is, that we gain by losing. We live by dying. There's an ebb and flow to all life, this continuous, ever-repeating rhythm of life and death. It's built into the very fabric of the universe. Step outside right now and you look around, and spring, new life, is slowly but predictably breaking through the death and dormancy of winter. Nature is reminding us once again what is so difficult to accept as humans, that the key to living a brave, resilient, and vibrant life is learning how to die before we die. We cannot grow without some suffering and even some self-dying along the way. But of course, no one actually wants to die before they die. Nobody, even with the bravest intentions of becoming stronger or more alive as a person, no one would sign up for the painful defeats in life, like a divorce, or the death of a loved one, a job loss, a loss of a relationship. But if we live long enough, we eventually discover that we do not have to sign up for any of these things, because they will happen without our consent. They will happen unexpectedly, without explanation, and they will bring grief. Yet Jesus models for all of us a way through them that leads to life. He tells us that when these experiences do come, we always have a choice about what to do next. We can run from them or cling to what we feel we're losing. Or like a gardener, we can bury whatever in us must die now and work with whatever may still be salvageable and respond to whatever God is calling us to do next so that something new might actually grow and bear fruit. Jesus knew how to die before he died. He said those who love their life will lose it. Those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Jesus is not preaching self-hatred or self-loathing here. He simply knows that to be human is to have two selves at once. What Thomas Merton once called the true self and the false self. The true self is the real you, the vulnerable self. It's who you are before the world attaches to you any labels, expectations, or roles that define who you think you need to be. The true self is the essence of who you are, your true nature that's worthy and enough. It is your soul. But for most of us, it's the false self that gets the lion's share of our attention. The false self is an amalgam of all the values and expectations our world projects onto us. Our culture, education, titles, jobs, politics, families, achievements. The false self is the self we present to the world. It gets us affirmation and validation that we long for. It's all the labels we wrap ourselves in. Christian, American, male, female, straight, gay, Democrat, Republican, preacher, nurse, teacher, skinny, smart, educated, successful, wealthy. All these labels, they help us get through life. They're useful. They help us find jobs and love and belonging, influence, status. But they are just the costumes we wear. And if those costumes become our sole identity, we typically will do anything to keep them on. We might become striving or pretentious, clingy, manipulative, deceptive, even duplicitous. We might do all that just to protect those labels. So when Jesus says we must die to self or hate the self, he's talking about that false self. To die before we die is to be willing to take off the costume when the time comes. How do we do that? How do we die before we die? Zen Buddhists have a practice. They teach that every day we might imagine a little bird perching on our shoulder. And this little bird asks us only one question: is today the day? In other words, is today the day you're going to die? Is today your last day? Are you living for the right things today? Answering that question might make it easier for all of us to take off the costume and be our true self. The Stoics had a mantra called memento mori. It means, remember you will die. Many modern-day skeptics or Stoics today, in their pockets, they carry around this little medallion. It's a memento mori medallion. It bears the symbols of the tulip that represents life, and the skull, which represents death, and the hourglass, which represents time. It's a tangible reminder that, as they say, you could leave life right now. And remembering that we could leave at any moment might make it easier to take off the costume now and be our true selves. Maybe the psalmist said it best. Teach us to number our days, O Lord, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. 29,000. That's the number of days we humans, on average, are given to live. I was making hospital visits one afternoon when a patient I didn't know had requested to see a Methodist pastor. So I stopped by his room. He turned out to be a well-known celebrity. He'd come in for a routine knee surgery, but 2 days later developed near-fatal blood clots in both lungs. He almost died. And now he wanted to talk to a pastor about his life and about making some changes in his life. And that day he made some personal commitments to essentially take off some of those costumes and to live for his true self. Before I left, we prayed, and I left him my card. And he called me a few days later and said, coming that close to death was the best thing that's ever happened to me. He said, I woke up to my life and to God. In those moments, instead of mindlessly and compulsively pursuing some abstraction like money or happiness or the elusive good life, we are sometimes reduced to what is actually right in front of us by the forced realization of our human limits. And sometimes in those confined, vulnerable places in life, brought about often by hardship, we are drawn near to God and to our true self and to what really matters. And it's there that something new is waiting to sprout and bear new fruit. It's not that these circumstances produce new life by themselves. It's simply that they create the conditions by which our courage to do the hard things and the right things is met by God's generous possibilities for new and good things. And then we get to choose what to do about it in the next moment. The truth is this: each of us will die 1,000 deaths over the course of our lives. It's inevitable. But if we've learned how to die before we die, what remains, the true self, will endure and bear much fruit. Our takeaways for today: our hardships often create the conditions by which new life is possible. The key to a brave, resilient, and faithful life is learning how to die before we die. When we live for our true self, we find courage to do hard things.